அரசியல், சினிமா, விளையாட்டு, அறிவியல், தொழில்நுட்பம் மற்றும் வாகனம் குறித்த செய்திகளை தெரிந்து கொள்ள ஆதன் செயலியை தரவிறக்கம் செய்யுங்கள். உங்கள் ஆதன் அனைத்து விதமான முக்கிய செய்திகளை எழுத்து வடிவமாகவும், வீடியோவாகவும், ஆடியோவாகவும் அளிக்கிறது.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to speak to you on this subject today. Whenever there's an event, immediately we have to think about what will be the economic outcome of that event. The classic event of recent times is the COVID crisis. I think that when an event like this happens, many of us are first stunned by the event. We don't know how to react. And then events unfold subsequently, which give us better clarity of what the consequences are going to be. The one thing that events always teach us is that no event is going to help us in the next event. So while we have moved from the COVID crisis, we are now into this geopolitical crisis involving Russia, Ukraine, China and various other players. What events basically tell us is the vulnerability of the world in specific areas. The first one is dependency. When you have an event like this, that's when you realize how much the world is interconnected, how nations are very much dependent on each other for their economic survival, activity, and existence itself. If you see the current crisis, it is going to expose how we are dependent for three basic things. The first one is food, because Ukraine and Russia together are significant producers of wheat. They're very significant producers of corn, barley, and sunflower oil. As far as India is concerned, we import 45% of our sunflower oil from Ukraine and Russia together, 31% from Ukraine and another 14-15% from Russia. So suddenly, now we need to find another source for edible oil for our country. Given the fact that we have been blowing hot and cold with Malaysia, who's a primary supplier of palm oil historically, the entire edible oil sufficiency of our country will suddenly be tested by an event like this. If you take the West, they are also heavily dependent on wheat from these countries, and you have seen how the global wheat prices went up as soon as this war began. The one thing that we can be certain about in the case of food shortages is that any food shortage in any country ruled by the most powerful rulers can bring down the regime. So no country in the world can afford a food shortage. So when there is a crisis like this, countries which are dependent on Russia for food will have to scramble to go elsewhere and find new sources, and that's not easy. So food is the first area where we are going to see this dependency getting tested. The second area where we are going to see this dependency get very heavily tested is in energy, and that is happening with the European Union, because if you see the gas consumption of the European Union, nearly 40 to 45% of it comes from Russia. And if you see the oil consumption of European Union alone, 25% of their consumption comes from Russia. Even today, you're seeing supplies going from Russia to United States in crude oil. So you're seeing all these things only expose the dependency of the developed world on Russia for energy. So if, let's say, they close the tap of gas, if Russia closes, forget about the West saying they won't buy, then it will be a very, very nasty winter in Europe as we speak. So the timing of this war is basically to test the vulnerability of countries which are dependent, and that's in different areas. So energy is going to be a very, very important area. The third is metals. When you see the metal market around the world, if you see how it has reacted in the past few days, you have seen a sharp increase in prices of aluminium, nickel, palladium, gold, copper, everything. This is because Russia has got 5% of the global production, at least in a few metals. If you take aluminium, they are 5%, 6%, nickel. If you take palladium, they are 40%. Many of us are not very familiar with palladium, but palladium is very critical for the manufacture of catalytic converters, which is a very, very important component in every car. So if they are not able to source palladium, the global auto industry, which is the IC engine industry, will be in a state of shock. If you realize already this industry is just coming out slowly from the shock which the semiconductor shortage inflicted on them just a few years ago, in the last 2 years. So this is the secondary shock which could happen because of palladium. There is also a grave risk of the EV industry getting affected, because if there is a shortage of nickel, then that is going to be something which is also going to affect the EV industry's onward movement. You know, when an industry wants to scale up very fast and, you know, bring itself to global relevance in the shortest possible time, then availability of resources is very, very important. And when you have dependence across the world from some geographies, then a war like this is going to make it ugly, and it's going to become extended and protracted. We don't know how soon this will come back to normalcy. We all knew that the semiconductor crisis came as a shock, but nobody has been able to predict that when the crisis will end and normalcy will come back. Even now, organizations are saying that we are still having an impact of this shortage of semiconductors. So the war itself has exposed the dependency of nations on each other, and this can have a ripple effect in several areas. The next thing it has really opened up is the disruption. The primary disruption in the financial system is something which can be very, very far reaching. It's very easy to block Russia and take them out of SWIFT. But what about continuing trade? What about the counterparties? How are people going to protect themselves from bankruptcies? A small European country has lent most of the money to the Russian aviation industry, right? How will they repossess the planes, or how will they get the monies if you close the financial system? India, in that sense, still has this presence. There are Indian public sector banks which still help remit from Russia, and, you know, things are happening. But disruption in the financial system can create complete chaos. And disruption is going to happen across. It's not just in the financial system, it can happen in different areas. I'll give you one small example of disruption. How many of you know that a Russian company, Alrosa, is the world's largest producer of diamonds? Nearly 30% of diamonds comes from that one company. And they produce, as per data available for 2020, 19 million carats every year, right? You know who brings in 80 to 90% of the world's diamonds, polishes it and sends it back? It's India. So suddenly you will find that this disruption, which can happen in a place like Surat, because there is a war in Ukraine. So you don't know how disruption can come. And this is just one example. There will be multiple examples of how this disruption will hit us in different ways in different parts of the world. So that is something which we have not really factored in, because I don't think any businessman would have written this as a risk to his survival in the diamond industry. I don't think they would have thought about something like this coming at them after the COVID crisis. But that is how powerful disruption can be. The next thing is that there can be significant demand supply gaps. Now, see, if a country which produces 4 to 5% of a global resource goes out of the market, then suddenly there will be shortages, and there will be inventorization by those who are the user countries. For example, China is dependent on other countries to get iron ore and coal, and it's the world's largest steel producer, right? China brings everything from outside and produces steel, right? Similarly, a lot of countries which produce other products, and they depend on resources from these countries. So when there is a fight in the geography of resource producing nations, then the value adding countries are going to be in distress. Now what this means is that the global commodity markets will have a spike, right? So what is happening in this war, and what kind of disruption we are going to see, is something which we are completely unprepared for at a global level. But the good news is that India is relatively in a better position, because we have been trying very hard to produce more iron ore, produce more coal, produce more steel, most of the steel we need for our country. So we have done all these things. But think of the countries which have to bring in resources from outside and then produce and then bring the economy back to normalcy. Because what is the whole idea countries were having after COVID. They thought that they will all create big investments in infrastructure, and through those big investments, they will bring their economy back to a better shape, right? In that context, if you are going to have a sharp spike in commodity prices, then the cost of all these projects is going to become very high. Public debt is going to soar. The governments will have to borrow much more than they originally planned to invest. Sometimes government may not be in a position to even execute the project because their finances may be thrown out of gear. So this is the kind of disruption that we will see, and this is how you will see the demand supply gap getting affected in different commodities. When the demand supply gap gets affected, you will see production stoppages in countries which are completely resource dependent from outside, right? So those countries will be struggling to produce. So we will have to see how China is going to produce steel in the coming months, because they had shut down a lot of industries for the sake of the Winter Olympics. So the timing of this intrusion is very, very uncanny, because they have hit at a time when China wants to again start its production. So we'll have to see how China is going to become a source of many of the raw materials for the world, because it has reduced its production for the last 1 year, and then it's going to increase its production now. We'll have to see how they are going to again create inventory of these inputs for their production. So production stoppages is another factor which is going to be significant, and it's going to affect the world. So naturally, when you see the threat of production stoppages, when you are going to see disruption of supplies, then you will have stockouts, right? What will happen is everybody will try to store more materials than they need, and when they do that, naturally the inventory available in trade is going to go down. So you are going to see shortages, stockouts, and that is why as soon as this war happened, you saw the spike in wheat, you saw it in several commodities. Immediately there was a spike in commodity markets because there is a fear that inventories may be running low. The last and most important thing, which is a consequence of all these things, is inflation. I think that today geopolitics is squarely centered on inflation. I'm going to spend a little time to explain to you how this will affect. You have to understand that for the last several years, America has been a beneficiary, or the entire Western world has been a beneficiary of low inflation, right? So what happens when there is low inflation is that resource-rich nations are going to provide resources to resource-hungry nations without having the benefit of inflation, because they will always not get better value for their produce. But when inflation happens, it is going to favor resource producers. So those who are exporting countries, or those who are having more resources which they can share with the world, are going to be in a better place. And those who are consuming nations, like the US and a lot of the West, are going to be in trouble. Inflation is going to be the biggest, it is clearly going to be the biggest weapon in this war, and it is clear that inflation is going to hit in places which are ill prepared for it, and it is going to hurt a lot. So the outcome of this war on various countries, how it can affect various countries, will be squarely measured on inflation, because when prices go up like these, then you are going to see shortages, and everything that I said before, all the points I mentioned, will become more accented because of the inflation. So rising inflation is something which we have to deal with, and this war is timed in such a way to create a very, very significant impact on inflation in almost every area. Energy inflation, inflation in commodities, inflation in metals, inflation in food, and inflation in financial costs also. So you're going to see interest rates also start moving up, because that's the only way we will try to control things. So you have seen how the Sri Lankan bank, Sri Lanka is a classic case of how it can affect. And we don't really have a comeback to such a thing. So we don't have a swift comeback. It's going to take a long time. If you take our own example, I'm going to give an example of how we were affected by inflation in 2012. If you saw the sharp spike in inflation, you saw the exchange rates going down continuously for almost a fortnight in India in 2012, and it led to the complete collapse of the UPA. In fact, that was, in my opinion, the biggest political catalyst at that point in time. In countries which have rulers who are not democratically elected, inflation can be a very, very big threat. And in that sense, we have to see how China is going to manage this inflation. In countries where inflation has been very low and the citizens have benefited for long years from lower inflation. I think that we have to see how people are going to cope with it. Because the United States is a classic example of a place where there was hardly any inflation in all these three things. Okay, you hardly had any food inflation or energy inflation, so living was somewhat more easier on the people. I think that that's something that's going to change a lot. As far as India is concerned, so far we have taken an accommodative stance on inflation, but I don't know for how long we will be able to maintain this stance, and it is going to be our biggest challenge. So this entire conflict, to my mind, seems to be to test the resilience of the entire world. This is not just something where he is trying to test how China will react, or how US will react, or how Ukraine will react, or how Europe will react. By touching certain sensitive areas through this conflict, I think the resilience of the world, the economic sustainability of countries, the ability of governments to stick to their place, governments to stay in power, is going to be tested, and we are seeing that just in our neighborhood in Sri Lanka. I think you are going to see it in many more countries. As far as India is concerned, I think that we have in recent years tackled food inflation reasonably well. I think we have done a very, very decent job of it, but still we are some distance away from sufficiency of edible oils. I think that though we have started this project and there is a very, very strong conviction in the part of the government to create a self-sufficiency, it's still some distance away. So edible oil is something which can be a problem, but we have enough of rice and wheat, and so that is something which can be a source of comfort for us. So we have to see how we are going to manage inflation and how we are going to manage the macro challenges that arise from inflation. As far as the geopolitics is concerned, we already had all the points being brought out, and we're going to hear from Commodore also about it. But I would think that India has to keep inflation in check. We have to continue with our investment program, because I think that the economy in the last 2 years has stabilized because the government has invested with high conviction. So the government has to continue to invest with the same high conviction. We have a plan, we must stick to the plan, and if we stick to that plan, then we must have the resources available to execute that plan. We cannot again afford having very high inflation in metal prices or in cement or in all other areas which are material to executing our infrastructure plan. So India has to invest aggressively in infrastructure, and this crisis will have an impact which has to be moderated and minimized by the government. So that is something which is squarely in the domain of the government and how it manages industry. One more factor which we have to be very, very conscious of is that all these ideas of self-sufficiency, Make in India, Atmanirbhar, are timely. We have taken these at a time when all these disruptions were not spoken about or not thought about. So we are a little ahead of the curve, but I believe that we need to accelerate and we need to get to a better place so that more disruptions in the future will keep us better prepared than we are now. So that is something that we need to achieve, and time is definitely short. So I think the government will be hitting the ground running, and we need to also as a society understand the urgency of creating this kind of a self-sufficiency, because unless we are self-sufficient as a country, our stability financially and economically will always get stretched and tested, and that is something which we cannot afford, because inflation is something which India should try to always keep under check, and that is something which you have to take a bipartisan view. It doesn't matter who is in power. If we don't control inflation, it's going to be the biggest economic and political weapon which we are going to inflict on ourselves. In that sense, this war has more economic intent than military intent. That's how I see it. And the ripple effect which it can create is much, second order effects are all going to be much higher than what we have seen before, and what we are still anticipating. And if it prolongs, I think that the West is going to be very badly threatened. As far as India is concerned, it all depends on how our government sticks to plan and ensures that we keep running at the same pace that we are at the moment. So if we are able to maintain the status quo of how we are functioning today, I think that itself would be a very good achievement, because we are seeing growth just ahead of us, and we need to just achieve that growth and keep moving. So in that sense, we are slightly better placed than the West, but we still need to keep inflation in check. So the biggest threat that I see in all these things is inflation, and if we have it in check, we would be in a good place and we would come out stronger from this crisis. Thank you for your patience here.